Today, most people remember NASA's Apollo moon missions as heroic feats and milestones in humanity's development. Yet some of the facts and dramas surrounding the missions are simply forgotten or even deliberately concealed. What is it that nobody should know about the Apollo missions, and why does NASA keep the explosive data under lock and key? We now reveal the secret and show you the most frightening details and most tragic accidents around the Apollo missions. Apollo 1 – Tragic Fate. Today, everyone knows the names Neil Armstrong or Buzz Aldrin, but names like Gus Grissom, Edward H. White II, and Roger B. Chaffee have been forgotten over time. Perhaps because the fate of the mission, later known as Apollo 1, tore a trauma into humanity that everyone wanted to quickly forget. In January 1967, NASA's top test pilot, Gus Grissom, was still going hunting with his 13-year-old son, Mark. Later, the boy reported that his father had seemed somehow tense. Grissom was to command a test run a few days later on a space capsule that was later christened Apollo. Telling his wife, Betty, before the launch, Grissom said, "When I die, have a party." Around the same time, veteran astronaut Ed White was spending time with his 14-year-old son, Edward, and 7-year-old daughter, Bonnie. Roger Chaffee was also a loving father and spent much of the days leading up to the test run with his 8-year-old daughter, Cheryl. In the environment, Chaffee ran several times to announce how excited he was about the next step in his career as an astronaut. On January 27th, the three men boarded a space capsule. According to the plan, they were to perform a practice launch. The crew was already in place, and NASA staff started the countdown. Suddenly, Grissom smelled sulfur, which could indicate a gas leak. The countdown was immediately stopped. As a result, radio contact with NASA's control center broke off several times. Grissom grew impatient and said, "How are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings?" When technicians fixed the problem by filling the module with pure oxygen, the smell dissipated and the countdown continued. Since the flight was purely a test run, the capsule had not been fueled and was never supposed to lift off the ground. Quite a few of the NASA controllers took a short break. Only one stayed at the screens and witnessed the biggest drama in spaceflight up to that point. Suddenly, the man in the control center heard strange noises, followed by screams from Grissom and the other astronauts. NASA still has the full record of the death throes of the 3 men in the space capsule. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee died in the capsule. No one was around to put out the fire, and the 3 were completely alone on the launch pad, unable to open the capsule's door. On the footage, Ed White can be heard desperately trying to open the inner hatch, but it was designed so that it could only be opened from the outside. The astronauts didn't stand a chance. An investigation determined that death was not caused by the fire itself, but by poisoning from carbon monoxide and other toxic gases produced by the fire. In the evening, NASA employees had the sad task of breaking this terrible news to the children and wives of the astronauts. To honor the 3 astronauts, the test run, officially named Apollo Saturn 204, was later officially renamed Apollo 1. The Apollo 11 astronauts brought a plaque to the moon for their 3 colleagues from the very first mission, where it remains today. Apollo 11 – Humans land on the moon. It wasn't until 10 flights later that humans set foot on the moon. The flight of Apollo 11 with astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins on board is now legend. But hardly anyone knows what all went wrong during this flight and in what danger the astronauts found themselves. A team of 4,000 people worked for several decades to develop this flight. Armstrong and Aldrin themselves went through 2 years of training. As the Saturn V launch vehicle lifted off toward space, 25 million people in 33 countries were watching. An accident would have shaken the world. But all went well until the lunar module separated from the command module and landed on the moon. Suddenly, Aldrin saw that the navigator was sounding the 1202 alarm. The command center reported that the computer was overloaded with tasks, and the navigation system could not handle it. Captain Neil Armstrong had to pilot the capsule himself in an extremely dangerous area. The fuel gauge reading was alarmingly low, and the rocket engine was kicking up so much space dust that Armstrong and Aldrin could barely see. The two hovered in mortal danger until, against all odds, the module touched down gently on the surface of the moon. The spectators hardly got anything of this drama. What also hardly anyone knew is that Aldrin performed a Christian ritual before becoming the second man to follow Armstrong to the moon. Aldrin drank a drop of wine from a tiny bottle, ate breadcrumbs, and read a passage from the Bible. Only then did he put on a spacesuit and leave the module. At that moment, it seemed to him that he could smell the scent of the moon. Aldrin feared his spacesuit might leak because the smell, reminiscent of damp ash, was pervasive. The suit held tight, but Aldrin found himself at the mercy of another unexpected event. Unlike his colleague Armstrong, he had no speech prepared for his first step on the moon. Armstrong's phrase became legend, and Aldrin's first exclamation as a man on the moon was, "Magnificent desolation." After 21 hours and 36 minutes, it was time to leave that magnificent desolation. The return flight left without problems, but after landing in the Pacific Ocean, Armstrong and Aldrin suddenly had wet feet. Water was seeping into the capsule, which was supposed to be 100% leak-proof. For a moment, two of the greatest heroes of space travel had to fear drowning in the ocean after the successful flight to the moon. But shortly after, the hatch of the space capsule already opened and the recovery forces pulled Aldrin and Armstrong to the light and back to Earth. The two had been lucky. The follow-up mission was quite different. Apollo 12 Wobble to the Moon. When Commander Charles Conrad, with Apollo 12 and two colleagues set off into space on November 14, 1969, the weather conditions almost prevented the launch for the second time. But NASA decided to launch the rocket from Kennedy Space Center despite strong winds and rain. Among the spectators was President Richard Nixon himself, as the Saturn V lifted off at 11:22 a.m. local time. Charles Conrad and his colleagues Alan Bean and Richard Gordon saw a bright flash 36 seconds later. Dozens of warning lights lit up in the cockpit. Hastily, the men went through all the scenarios they had trained for, but none of them had ever seen so many malfunction warnings at once. Another 16 seconds after the first flash came the second. Conrad had only a few minutes to decide to abort the flight, but Apollo 12 continued into the sky. Conrad was very hesitant about whether to risk his life and the lives of his colleagues. Then the engineers on the ground began giving him much-needed instructions. Conrad was furious because every second counted and he couldn't cope because of the panic. Suddenly, his colleague Alan Bean quickly intervened, found the switch, and the panel lit up again. The mission was saved, but for how long? The next problem was not long in coming. But because of the problems at launch, one of the fuel stages detached later than planned. The result was it found itself orbiting the moon instead of going into space. The part was not only a hazard to Apollo 12, but continues to threaten future lunar missions to this day. The problems didn't end there, however. During the landing on the moon, a malfunction was discovered in one of the engines. With great difficulty, the team managed to land the module with minimal damage. Conrad's first words on the moon were thus also less euphoric. He went for, "Wow, that may have been a small step for Neil, but for me, it's a very long one." In the next moment, Conrad tripped and fell. Fortunately, the moment was not televised due to a damaged camera. Later, Conrad said of his flight to the moon, this whole mission was like a typical horror movie, where a group of friends are having fun and goofing around. So despite the danger, the astronauts still had fun. After the failure of the live transmission, things were not good for the Apollo program for a while. The sponsors, who had paid vast sums for advertising during the television broadcast, were upset, but NASA scraped together new funds. The euphoria was great when Apollo 13 was secured. At that time, nobody suspected that everything would become much worse. Apollo 13. Houston, we have a problem. Fortunately, the Apollo 13 rocket launch went off without a hitch. Astronauts Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes were on their way to the moon. Shortly thereafter, the radio message that made history occurred. Houston, we have a problem. Apparently, an oxygen tank had exploded in the Apollo 13 rocket service module, and the astronauts were beginning to lose air. John Aaron, the chief technician at the Mission Control Center, came under pressure. Immediately, He had to decide what solution would work for the astronauts. The landing on the moon was off. That much was clear. But how were 3 astronauts supposed to travel back to Earth in a space capsule that had lost an oxygen tank, and where it was unclear to what extent other oxygen tanks had been damaged? In the Odyssey command module, all power was dropping dramatically. Aaron realized that the 3 astronauts aboard the Aquarius landing capsule would be safest. So, all 3 men had to transfer to a tiny capsule that was really only designed for landing 2 men on the surface of the moon. And a new danger emerged. After the reorientation of the mission, it was necessary to recalculate the trajectory. This could have resulted in the astronauts simply getting lost in space. Still, it was worth the risk. As if in a sardine can, the 3 men persevered for more than 90 hours. There was just enough oxygen in the capsule, but it was freezing cold at 0 degrees. The food supplies were no longer usable, and the astronauts could neither eat nor drink or go to the toilet. On Earth, millions of people fevered with the 3. When Apollo 13 landed on Earth, the astronauts were celebrated like heroes. Of all the astronauts who had set off into space, they had to put up with the toughest conditions. Nevertheless, the 3 were glad to have stayed alive. Despite the failure, NASA continued the Apollo missions. Already 1 year later, Apollo 14 was launched in 1971, and 3 more missions followed, which were very successful except for some minor problems. Then it became quiet around the moon, and for nearly 50 years, nobody was there anymore. But this is to change soon. In 2026, the first manned flights to the moon will take place. NASA, as well as Chinese spaceflight and SpaceX, will send humans to the moon in a new age of space exploration. Well, did these accidents and dramas send a shiver down your spine? And how do you feel about the safety and chances of success of the upcoming lunar missions?